go ahead and get back to our session, part two, to talk about sustainability, which obviously is very much related to the question of transportation, and that's why we're talking about both of them at the same time. Maybe we can kick off, and we'll just introduce our panel. Julie Wolf is joining us. Julie is on the Wilmette Environmental and Energy Commission, EEC. It's easier to say EEC, so I apologize for tripping on that one, Julie. That's what I meant to say. And we're also joined by Beth Drucker, who is with Go Green Wilmette, which is not just a Wilmette-based organization. Go Green extends beyond there, and maybe we'll have a chance to ask a little bit about that. And Brett and Cindy are with us again to talk about the sustainable side of tonight's topic. So with that, we'd like to kick off with a little bit of a presentation to talk about the sustainability plan that the village has. As I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the things that's really interesting and exciting and in some ways challenging about having these two topics be part of the comprehensive plan is that the village has been doing work on this. This is not just come out of nowhere. This is not a comprehensive plan process saying, hey, you know what we ought to do? No, the fact is that the village has been working on these issues for any number of years. And so the Sustainable Community Strategic Plan is part of that. And Julie, maybe we could get you to tell us about it a little bit.
Sure, I'd be glad to. This plan was developed by the Environmental and Energy Commission and approved by the Village Board last year. It follows the Greenest Region Compact framework, which is a very specific framework of 10 areas that we'll get to in a minute. But they were very supportive, and it just made a good way to get started with it. So we decided that was the best way to go. So it addresses environmental and sustainability issues in Wilmette and has specific recommendations for reducing the environmental footprint. Next slide, please. The chapters in the plan are climate, which is really the overarching concern because that is the major thing. But within that, things that make Wilmette sustainable as a community: economic development, energy, land, leadership, mobility, which relates to what we were just talking about with the active transportation plan, as well as the fact that Wilmette has a lot of excellent transportation with Metra and the CTA, municipal operations, sustainable communities, waste and recycling, and water. Next slide, please. The existing conditions: Wilmette contributes greenhouse gases from electricity and natural gas use, basically because of its nature as a suburban community. People live here. We don't really have industry, but people and businesses, that's Wilmette's contributions to greenhouse gases. Some of the positive things are Wilmette has vast parkland, a great tree canopy, green space, and lots of lawn areas. There's good transportation or transit, bike, and pedestrian infrastructure, not used as much as might be desirable. And right now, trash, recyclables, and compost are separated, but there's certainly potential for improving on that too. And the water plant produces high quality water from Lake Michigan, which is itself threatened. Next slide. So the goals are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. This is a big goal, but a lot of other communities have adopted this, and it's what the Paris Accords called for, and that's our goal. Reducing waste, energy, water, and pesticide use, implementing and incentivizing native and sustainable planning, and improving alternative transportation options and use. Next slide. So specific recommendations are maximizing and purchasing renewable energy credits, implementing greenhouse gas reducing ordinances and expediting energy reduction projects, incentivizing and supporting sustainable and native landscaping, protecting the tree canopy and permeable surfaces, and improving the biking and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Next slide. So more recommendations: protect Lake Michigan, which is an incredibly valuable resource, and ensure continued water quality. Wilmette provides water, has its own water plant, provides water for Wilmette and several surrounding communities. So that is of vital importance. Manage stormwater in a thoughtful way. Pursue food composting at a larger scale. It's already done somewhat, but there's potential for more. And implement a teardown tax and encourage multifamily development. And last, something we're hoping to do fairly soon, employ a full-time sustainability coordinator.
Well, thanks for that tour, Julie. That was really great. And again, the plan is available on the village's website. We encourage everybody to go and take a look at that. Brett, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what else is going on out there.
Sure. Brett Emmons with EOR, done a lot of community sustainability planning as well as water work in different locations. So I wanted to just walk you through more just kind of stimulate some ideas and discussion, as been touched on a few times here by Michael and others. Julie, there is a lot that the community is already doing. So we know you're quite a ways down this path and just looking for ways to kind of pick up momentum and find those catalysts to keep things moving. So we'll just go through a few examples. You can go to the next slide. Just talk about, so what are some of the assets you already have? You already have a good plan. You have a mature community. You have a lot of transit options already there, which many other communities would be very envious of. You can build on a real strong tree program, really nice walkability. This is not an all-inclusive list, just kind of a few things to touch on, but also where there's some opportunities, where are there some things that you can still step to a new level. And we've already spent a bit of time talking about this complete green streets idea, just making the community much more walkable and having those streetscapes do a lot more work for you. In the water sector, an area that's picking up a lot of energy across the country, not just in the arid Southwest, but really everywhere. It's just this idea of, we think of water or stormwater as a waste product that we have to get rid of. Well, maybe it can be reused as an asset. Food systems, trying to think of kind of local organic types of options, and there's many others. So maybe we'll come up in our Q&A, hoping to hear other people's ideas. Just pulled this from another, kind of what we're trying to do here, share other ideas of what other people are doing. This is from a comprehensive plan where sustainability is one of the themes brought into that comprehensive plan in another community. So you can see the kind of areas that this can touch on, similar to what Julie just covered in terms of energy, water, waste, food systems, climate resiliency, no net loss of ecosystems. And I think the other thing I did want to note here is just like your energy policy. Some of these can be pretty lofty, trying to get to this net zero in a lot of these different areas really is, in some ways it seems like it's maybe reaching too far, but in other ways I think it is good and fine to have these lofty aspirational goals and then start to put the building blocks to get you there. And in some cases, they're not as actually hard, or I shouldn't say that, they're not as far away as we might think. And there are, we've seen some great accomplishments in different things, in different areas. Next slide. So a few that we had done some research on here was, for instance, zero waste. There are a lot of communities making tangible progress towards that. San Diego has some great programs. Vancouver, BC, you'll see them show up in several things. And actually Santa Monica, California is another place we've gone to that has a lot of great programs. This is an example of sort of their zero waste strategy for their operations system. So, I mean, these things, they may seem quite high bars and aspirational, but there are tangible progress towards getting there in many communities. Same with energy. Net zero energy, again, seems like a difficult thing, but there are a lot of renewable energy sources. Hawaii is really a leader in a lot of ways. Being an island nation or an island state, they have kind of the need to be very creative with how they manage a lot of their resources. Lancaster, California was another good example of, taking a lot of steps towards this net zero energy. And Montpelier, Vermont was another one that came on our radar as someplace that really is kind of stepping up on that energy front to really do a lot. Next slide. For food systems is another one. I think that, for a community like yourselves, you don't have a lot of agricultural land around, but you are a consumer of food, and, making local sustainable food systems as the end user as a priority, you start to push that back up your supply chain, and creating things like farmers markets and places where local foods can be sold can be just some really nice, sometimes small examples, but meaningful examples towards this. So there's a lot of different areas that you can work in. Next, I think I'll just go through, we do a lot of work in water, net zero water is an area where, again, it seems like a high bar to say that a community could think in terms of this, but we're actually seeing a lot of successes in this. Seattle has some great guidance and regulations towards net zero water. Another one that comes up is in Australia, and actually in terms of that water reuse that I talked about, stormwater reuse, Australia is actually a leader in the country. They're actually a great model that we look to a lot because they do have a lot of arid areas in their country, and so they've become very creative and come up with some great examples of this. Sometimes this can happen at the building scale of net zero buildings, and there's a bunch of great examples there all over the place. And a community we worked with here locally, where they do have a lot of urban development that's occurring, but they've actually set a policy and a program, a master plan in place, system plan for net zero runoff at the end of the day. And we're actually right on track with that. And it's working quite well. And again, that's one where I think, even the staff involved in the planning level were a bit doubtful whether this could actually happen. And there are very few examples out there in the country where it does, but now we're on track 10 years later, right on track to do it. And that, those staff that were very kind of wondering or doubtful at the beginning are the kind of the best evangelists as projects come in to say, hey, no, we've seen this work and it can work, so we can be creative and we can get there. So the thought here was the next round, I'll just kind of run through a bunch of examples. Again, this is kind of just to kind of spur some ideas and thoughts and hopefully get the discussion flowing here of different examples that, kind of give you ideas of how we can be more creative, and even in areas where we think it's difficult, it can happen. So one of project here in Central High School, it's a very urban inner city high school. It had a very stark, uninviting approach to the school, and actually it was the parent group that came forward and said it really wasn't about water, even though water was a huge advantage, but they just wanted it to be a much more inviting place for the school. It turns out, after we master planned and got the school involved, a lot of these areas were taken from hardscape concrete and reverted back to green space. A lot of outdoor seating. There's actually an outdoor classroom now. Their science curriculum goes out and takes samples from several of these underground areas. So the site discharges much less polluted stormwater, and also is a much more inviting space. So the theme I think you'll see with a lot of these is, there are a lot of win-wins that come out of this. You can be creative, do something good for the environment, and actually make your community much more livable and a nice place to be, a higher quality of life. Next slide. Another example, we're doing kind of a peer review on a Queens Quay is in Toronto. There's a lot of lakefront redevelopment in Toronto going on. This is actually a segment that has been built, and that we're now in the planning of the next segment. So it's very, there's a trolley way line being extended. There's bikeways. And Toronto's a super active bike community, activating pedestrian spaces. And it's really, that particular part of that downtown is kind of a forgotten, unsafe area to be able to get across some busy streets. But they're kind of rethinking that entire area to be able to get people back down to the lakefront to reactivate a lot of the redevelopment there. And next slide shows what people maybe don't realize is there's a lot going on with the water management in this area, even with the higher lake levels, which has been a major concern. They're actually taking a lot of that runoff in this very urban core and doing a lot to feed the vegetation, the trees that they want to have there for the streetscape, and vegetation planting beds. So a lot of this water actually is being taken up and treated before it discharges to the lake, because they do have some lake water quality. They want people down by the lake. It's a great asset, but at the same time, the runoff does create some water quality issues on the lake. So this is kind of a great example of where people, they see the quality of life being improved and the better circulation, but there's actually a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that are very good for the environment and good for the lake, also happening, as well as just multimodal transportation. Here's another example of, again, kind of very urban waterway or urban roadway that we're actually doing some areas where we're, greening and also taking care of water runoff. So you're getting multiple benefits out of the same area. Next one. That's in Iowa. Here's an affordable housing project where several awards won on this, where basically all the water is being captured. It's being used in this urban garden. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a water feature in the upper left there. And there's some very many places where we can have people interact with the open spaces to make it more of it's an amenity while it's also taking care of water issues. Next slide. I'll move through these quickly, just to, like I say, just kind of plant the idea. Los Angeles, California has some streets where they are coming back and putting the water, into the ground instead of having it just run off and pollute downstream water bodies. Next slide. Portland, Oregon is another one. Here's an outdoor cafe we visited. They have rain gardens intermingled with the tables right there. So kind of just want to break down this idea that you can't have these kind of water management kind of facilities and these sustainability and these habitat things happen in such an urban streetscape when they actually very much can happen. Next slide. We're getting towards the end. Here is another nice project where I know it's a winter shop, but it was basically one big slab of asphalt. So when you see a redevelopment into an office from a kind of an industrial use, you can actually bring a lot of greening back into that. And this is another site where it's basically zero runoff, net zero runoff after the site was developed. Next slide. Getting towards the end. Here's a little pocket park that was developed as part of that, where they actually capture all the water, treat it, and then reuse it for this water feature, an educational feature there in the back, and a little pocket park where the neighbor people can come and hang out. Next slide. A couple more here in sort of commercial redevelopment. It was the kind of industrial, and now it's kind of coming back. It's not far from the river, being redeveloped. So you got permeable pavers, rain gardens, all these things that are able to be basically bring an asset to the community while also serving an infrastructure function for the city. Next slide. That same area where, again, it can be done very tastefully and creatively, where you actually improve the quality of the streetscape. Next slide. So yeah, the last thing I had here was just to kind of get along this idea, trying to implant this idea that, you know, doing a lot of these sustainable elements like we're talking about with complete streets, and Vancouver has some great blue-green street programs where it's activating the people wanting to be on the street, wanting to exercise, wanting to be healthier, use the pedestrian way. And it's also behind, you know, maybe it's behind the scenes or not behind the scenes, it actually is providing a lot of other benefits.
Okay.
We have for ideas.
Well, thanks, Brett. Those are great examples. In fact, I actually held over a question from previously. Somebody had asked about whether or not the curb allocations we talked about earlier can still be part of stormwater runoff. And I think the slides you had showed that stormwater runoff can not only be incorporated into whatever we're talking about doing, but can be done as an amenity, not just as a big chunk of concrete. So thanks for that tour. So let's dive into our questions. And the first one we wanted to ask was really about whether or not some of these green infrastructure things and these sustainability efforts that we talked about are seen in Wilmette. So Beth and Julie, we'll start with you. How are these seen as a positive to Wilmette? Are any of these things seen as a negative? So some people think these things are hassles or native plants aren't pretty and those kinds of things. What do you see from Wilmette residents on both sides of that coin?
Julie, do you want to start that? And I'll.
Sure. Let's see. When the downtown Wilmette was redone last year, we ended up putting a lot of native plants in. They're not exactly rain gardens, but they are native plants. They've been very, very well received. People really like those. We have done a little bit of green infrastructure in a few neighborhoods. Quite honestly, I haven't really seen it yet, so I don't know how well it's been received. Beth, what has your experience been?
I think that people are generally very supportive of sustainability and green infrastructure. They also want to make sure that it works. I know we tried with some green alleys, and the village wasn't. I think they were not as successful in managing stormwater as the village wanted. So I think everyone is cautious to make sure that we're using taxpayer dollars for projects that really make a difference. I will say, I will concur with Julie that the native plantings that Kate Amoroso has designed and put in throughout Wilmette, I think has just vastly improved what our downtown area looks like. And she's done a really great job with that.
Okay, great. What do you see as the things that people are maybe a little bit most concerned? What's the scariest part about this for people, Beth and Julie, as you talk to Wilmette residents about having to be sustainable or change what they do? Are there things that people are concerned about that maybe we want to let them know they don't need to be?
Oh, I think people are concerned about sitting in a cold, dark house and that sort of thing. Whereas the one thing that actually is starting to take off is community solar, which is Wilmette. There was a program through Go Green Wilmette that I signed up with a few months ago. And then the village has a program now that they've been publicizing. People have been signing up for that. So they can be part of a community solar farm. And it's basically like an electricity offset, but that's something that's very positive, that is new.
Yeah, I think there's always a little bit of tension between for a village to make the rules that benefit the collective good when they in fact limit the individual options for private landowners and residents. So I think there's always some tension there, and whether that's when can you use a leaf blower on your own property? What can you do with the trees on your property? Are you allowed to dump your stormwater, into the sewer, or, do you have to not disconnect your sewer line? So I think that's always a problem. So part of it is to educate why these new ways of doing things are really necessary. We just simply cannot continue to operate the way we've always been, because we have new challenges, and the awareness that we now have just a real sustainability crisis is, I would say, very accepted in our community.
Okay. And what about in other places? Brett, you talked about a couple of examples where there was a little bit of concern. What kind of things, Brett, and then Cindy, if you wanted to add anything, do you see that people are concerned about having to do?
Yeah, I think I've seen that turnaround in terms of, this native looking a little too wild. I think as designers, we've gotten better to kind of have something that's a bit more managed, but still, I guess I've been surprised to see how much attitudes have shifted in just a handful of years, where it's now, the kind of the butterfly habitat is now people are rallying around having kind of natives in the landscape, as before they were seen as kind of wild and too woolly. So that's been interesting and almost exciting to see that shift so quickly. Another one that's come up with is like safety. If you have a lot of these plantings and these end up creating these huge planting areas in an urban landscape, that makes people very nervous. So yes, there has to be a lot of, and that has been addressed through a lot of care and picking the right plants, so that these are kind of more at that knee height type of size, or maybe just a little larger, but they're not creating these very large, robust areas that, don't feel comfortable in the evening hours. So that's been a good one. And I do think, having that, especially if you're going to do these to try to help activate kind of your commercial walkable zones, working very closely with the landowners and the businesses around there, so they understand what you're trying to accomplish, or that's the point about making sure they understand the why, and then letting them be involved and trying to figure out how to set it up so that they actually see it as a benefit and not as a negative.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would agree with the type of plantings that particularly for pedestrians, that you want to make sure, part of feeling safe is feeling that you're visible, so you don't want to be hidden by plantings. I think we talked at our last the transportation piece about maintenance of sidewalks and bike lanes, and so just making sure that it's maintained year round is important. But I think I agree also with Beth that talked about that there are trade-offs, and that people have to understand what those trade-offs are, and why is it so important that we make these changes now, and that you can't keep doing what you've been doing. So I think that's part of just involving people in the decision-making process.
And as a planner of a certain age, I will tell you that I remember when people started talking about recycling, and the naysayers thought it was just absolute madness that we would separate the things we threw out and not throw all of them away. And now it's second nature. So the points you've all made about education being an important part of this, I think, are significant.
Good example.
I'm sorry, and Julie, you talked about Wilmette's energy use and carbon footprint, and the plan talked about how electricity and natural gas are some of the major elements of that for the village. Maybe we could get you to talk a little bit about what the plan says, or what your thoughts are in terms of how to reduce that impact.
Okay, we actually at the EEC met last night, and we were looking at some options for that. So certainly going with solar energy is good. Before the development of our sustainability plan, I had the opportunity to go to the North American Climate Summit, in downtown Chicago, which was amazing. I thought, wow, solar sounds great. You see it in the Southwest. I don't know how feasible it is here. And at that summit, they talked about one of the states that did some of the most solar was Minnesota. And I thought then, if they can do it, we can do it. So community solar certainly is good. The other thing that we're looking at is renewable energy credits. And they're actually, Evanston, an adjoining community, has been using renewable energy credits for years. Basically, what those do is they give an incentive to development of alternative energy. It might not necessarily be here in Wilmette, but it helps give an incentive for development of usually wind or solar energy, and that helps reduce the carbon footprint. Maybe not necessarily here, but in general. So those are some things we're looking at.
Beth, if I could ask you in terms of, in part answering this question, maybe you could talk a little bit about Go Green Wilmette.
Okay, so Go
So I
Green.
know the question wasn't on the list, but I figured you could do it.
I can do this one. Go Green Wilmette is our community-based environmental organization. We were started in 2006, and the mission is to raise environmental awareness, inspire people to take action, and to create a more sustainable community. To do that, we work with the village closely, businesses, the park district, schools, the library, and of course, with our residents. And we are, for example, we serve on the Nutria High School Sustainability Committee. We are meeting tomorrow with the District 39 School Sustainability Committee. The Park District has partnered with us on many projects, especially habitat maintenance projects. So, but what we often reach out to the residents to help them figure out how they can do more to address climate change and other concerns about pollution and limited resources. So we do webinars. We have one tomorrow night, which is addressing climate change at home, filled with great tips. We'd love to have anyone there. We also do things like we are sponsoring a solar tour this Sunday. So right here in Wilmette, you can visit about 12 different houses that have solar tours. We're also having an EV car show. So what we try to do is we bring information to people in a fun and engaging way with the hope that it will help change their behavior. And then when some Wilmette residents change behavior, it tends to be a little bit catching. So we're hoping to help Wilmette meet their goals, which are very ambitious. 2030 is not very far away. We're going to need everybody on the team to make those goals. So we're really fortunate that in our community, we have a sustainability commission, we have staff assigned to do this kind of work, and we also have an environmental group.
There are things to be done. Let's talk
And,
about water, shall we? Oh, I'm sorry, Brett, did you want to?
Well, kind of just building on Beth's comment, someone in the Q&A, Chris had mentioned that they had installed a rain garden on their land, and now a lot of neighbors have come by asking about it. So you're right. I mean, sometimes just getting it out there and letting people see it, all of a sudden it becomes, instead of this scary, strange thing, something they're kind of attracted to.
Right. In fact, Julie has been a host for our sustainable yard tour. Every summer, we find 5 or 6 yards that are really doing things differently, and we invite the community out to see how we're changing the way we care for our yards. Today at a webinar, the lawn care industry actually has a massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And so anything we can do to reduce our use of energy intensive lawn care is going to help the village meet their goals as well.
And so one of the questions that just popped up was about all those lawns and how the impact they have and what kind of incentives or programs there are in terms of rain gardens. And I know you mentioned some of them here. Are there others that you want to leave people with, or maybe send them to a resource they could find out more about replacing lawns?
Actually, the village was part of something called Rain Ready. The village now has its own partial reimbursement program if someone installs a rain garden, and there would be information on the village website about that.
Great. Village website is a great place for a lot of these answers. Let me go back to our questions. One of the ones that we wanted to talk about was water and how water fits into the village in terms of its character and it's dealing with sustainability. And Julie, it was sort of interesting to hear you talk a couple of times about Lake Michigan being threatened. And maybe we could get you to talk a little bit more about what that means. I think we all take the lake for granted, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means for the lake to be threatened. And then if others like to share some thoughts about how we deal with water and stormwater in Wilmette and generally.
Okay, sure. I think there are lots of threats to the lake. Changing water levels, they've been high, they've been low, they naturally go up and down. There's a great demand for lake water. Wilmette supplies our own water needs within the community as well as several other communities. There are communities in some of the western suburbs that have wells going dry and they would like Lake Michigan water, but it's not an endless resource. There are also things like permanent chemicals and plastics that can be in the lake, and general pollution. And in managing stormwater, it's easy to think, oh, just send it into the lake, but it can be full of pollutants. It can be at a higher temperature than is desirable for the lake. So it's important to protect it from runoff that could cause pollution and really damage the lake.
Right.
One thing, that one of the first webinars we ever had that we offered, or programs in the library, was with Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, and Deb Shore said something that stunned me. 16 years ago, I did not know this. Every drop of water that is used by a Wilmette resident never goes back to Lake Michigan. It goes to the Gulf of Mexico, as does every drop of water used in the city of Chicago. And I think that kind of can blow people's minds, and it helps make us aware that water conservation is really an important thing until we can figure out how we can start recharging the lake with the water that we use.
Yeah, I love that map of the watersheds in the Chicago area. There's a reason we have a ridge road up and down Chicago and the North Shore, because everything that goes to the other side of Ridge Road, yeah, like you said, goes to the Gulf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, plus any water that you might use to make a cup of tea or anything like that, or rinsing your salad in the sink. That water that goes down the sink has come from Lake Michigan and it goes to the Gulf.
Brett, maybe you can talk about some of the benefits of some of those installations that you showed with the natives and the drainage, and about how they're not just there to look good, that they're cleaning the water and they're slowing down the flow of water. What are some of the benefits of those things that you showed us before?
Yeah, in terms of the water cycle, it almost comes down to that kind of a basic of a concept. And what's been described here is that classic case where you're sort of breaking this water cycle of where the water normally comes from and where it normally goes. So these little pockets of putting in like rain gardens, letting the water filter back down into the soil and into the ground. These are all natural, the way nature takes care of water in that natural water budget. So you're basically, over time we've tended to engineer and forget about those natural solutions. So you're basically now kind of bringing these back into the built environment and allowing plants and the soil to reconnect those water areas. And rather than becoming a waste product and a problem that we're fighting with flooding and making our beaches unswimmable at times because of the things that are washing off into there, you're actually allowing the plants and the soil to absorb that again as it naturally would. So this is kind of a new as in 10 or 15 years, 20 years, where we started realizing that, it's not just kind of throttling down the rate of the water and just the flood control, but there's also this overall question of volume and all the pollutants that volume carries. So the shift in stormwater management has been kind of going away from this idea of just bigger pipes and big ponds to more of a try to keep the water more at the source, let the raindrop stay close to where it falls and replenish itself versus trying to manage it, which is very costly, and then try to clean it up, which is very costly. And I think with your having a lake there, we work with a lot of communities where it is a little bit of out of sight, out of mind. So sometimes it can be harder to convince people to, do the right thing because it's the right thing. But when you have water resources and a beach there a beach right there in town, it's much more easy for the residents to make the connection and say, oh, well, I guess this water that runs out of my street is going to be right down there where my kids play along the sandy shoreline. So maybe it does make sense that I should pay attention to what happens, and I would be willing to see that improve. So I think you've got this natural connection of the people in the water that makes it much easier to make these things happen.
You touched, Brett, on a topic that's in a couple of our questions, which is this idea of incentives. So there can be ordinances that require people to do things or install things in a certain way or build their homes in a certain way. And I think you've talked about an incentive of just care for what's around us. But what have you all seen either locally or in the state or nationally that are the kind of incentives that encourage residents to do the right things? And do you have any suggestions or thoughts about what kind of incentives you've seen that might be appropriate for Wilmette?
Yeah, it's another great question or great idea, because there are we worked with a lot of entities that have programs where they do provide shared funding, and it can be fairly generous. I think that's found that that's usually needed. So when people are thinking about doing it, while they're redeveloping, it may be required. If they're just sort of thinking about this water issue, there can be funding sources that help them do projects. I think also when you're doing some sort of street work or the city is doing something in their corridor, that's a perfect time to say, here, we want to deal with our street water and you've got your front yard. Can we combine and do something there that will kind of reimagine the streetscape and include more things like rain gardens that will allow the water to go in? And I think the other piece that we've seen that a couple other ideas is that, and not only to provide the money to build it, but also to provide some money in terms of the planning and technical assistance. That can also be a very common barrier that gets overlooked. We've seen programs mature where they make sure that they give some money up front to make sure that people understand and get the technical assistance that they want so that they can get it to the point of applying for a grant. Because oftentimes there'll be monies available to build it, but then if you don't have the wherewithal and the money to figure it out, then the money just sits there unused. So that's been an important thing, is connecting the dots there, helping them all along the whole process, I guess, either with the technical assistance directly or a grant that helps them do the planning stage, and then a separate grant that does the implementation stage. And one last one I want to just squeeze in here is like the stormwater utility. A lot of communities, I'm not exactly sure if Wilmette has a stormwater utility. I mean, just like you would have a sewer utility or a water utility, a lot of communities now have stormwater utilities that say, the amount of runoff that's generated from your site, in kind of a simplified way, you end up getting charged to help maintain and take care of the stormwater system. Well, you can build credits into that so that and this can add up for certain land uses, so that if they're paying several $1,000s, maybe for a commercial site or a business, several $1,000s a year for their stormwater utility, if they will come and do rain gardens and do things to retain the water on site, a lot of these programs have been set up that they will then reduce their stormwater utility because they're no longer burdening the system. So they actually have an incentive program built in indirectly through the stormwater utility program.
Great. Beth, Julie, anything locally that you've seen either that the village is doing or some of the other communities that you're familiar with that you think might be appropriate for the village?
But we do, in fact, have a stormwater utility fee. Yeah, and it was part of the whole big project that's mostly complete now for stormwater management that included some green infrastructure. So yes, that is happening. Beth, you probably are more familiar with what other communities are doing, because I know you're in touch with a lot of them.
I think an amazing idea is tiered water rates. Highland Park does this, where there's a base rate for what the average family uses, and those people that use an excessive amount of water for whatever reason, they pay the lowest rate for that starter amount, and then it gets more and more expensive based on how much they use. And so people who are refilling swimming pools, they're going to pay more for that water because it's not considered an essential use of water. So I think that's a brilliant idea. It helps with conservation, and quite frankly, it helps a municipality raise some money off of higher water rates.
Julie, you mentioned the idea of a sustainability coordinator for the village. One of our questions was about how are sustainability initiatives coordinated now, and maybe what are some of the best practices that you've seen around the region for coordinating water management and habitat preservation and transportation, and coordinating those different elements of sustainability?
Well, if you look at the open land in Wilmette, a lot of it is owned by the Park District, and we've coordinated some with them. I think probably Go Green Wilmette has worked with them more than the village has, but there has been more intergovernmental cooperation between just comparing notes, working on some land management things together with the village and the park district. Also, our library has done some amazing sustainable things. They have geothermal, they have a permeable paver parking lot. And I've personally spoken to the library board to see what their experiences were with that. But I do feel that there's more conversation, and the schools too are doing a lot. I believe some of the schools are installing some solar panels and things like that. I think they got some grants. So I feel like there's starting to be more conversation back and forth. And there's an interesting area, Elmwood Dunes, that it's like a park, but it's run by the village. It's a right-of-way that has native plants managed by volunteers. And some of the volunteers also help manage and maintain some of the natural areas at Gilson Park, and I believe at Mallinckrodt too. So I think there is starting to be more everybody talking to each other, because it's not that big of a village, and we're all better off if we can, talk and work together. But I think there is more of that going on now.
Excellent.
If I could step in and say something about the issue about a sustainability coordinator or director for Wilmette, that is something that Go Green Wilmette has suggested to the village for literally 15 years. There is no way to do this work well until someone's job involves doing it. And so whether this is a corporation or a university or a company or a village, you have to have people in place whose job it is to do this kind of work well. And there's kind of no end to it, and it's not going to go away. There's going to be more and more challenges. So I do encourage the village to move ahead and have a sustainability coordinator whose full-time job is juggling all of these pieces and coordinating it and working with the park district and working with the schools. That's how we'll really make good progress. The village has done a lot, and it's been great, and we have really much appreciated and watched their progress. But to do this really well, you need a sustainability coordinator.
Cindy, let me get you to build a bridge, if you will, pun intended, between the first panel and this one. And we talked about improvements in walkability and biker-friendly streets, and making those part of sustainability goals and the benefits of that. What strikes you from the first conversation that plays in really, really closely to this one that we're having now?
Well, I think that, just improving the bike and pedestrian by making those viable mode choices for people, so that they are not using their cars, so they're reducing their greenhouse gas. Transportation sector accounts for like a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions, and probably two-thirds of that comes from cars. So, just making those improvements so that really biking to the grocery store is a viable option for you. Relates directly to the sustainability, including some of the things that the other panelists have talked about, as far as combining the public works roadway type projects with sustainable projects, of adding in the drainage, and making that just part of a streetscape program. They all relate together, and they're like, it's sustainability and transportation are not silos. They're not their own pillars. It's a cross pillar program, and that gets back to Beth's comment about needing a sustainability coordinator, because it really does take somebody to cross pillar all of this work, but it's interrelated for sure.
Great. Before we move on from that, any other thoughts from other panelists about that interrelationship between the transportation discussion and the one we're having now about sustainability?
Yeah, one other thing that I think is really important is that villages work with each other, that the environmental commissioners from one village works with the other. Now, this year, Mike Brayman, our village manager, has been working with Gita Neukirchen for Highland Park to work on the issue of leaf blowers together. It's just there are so many issues that go beyond our borders, and it's much more effective if there's coordination. So this is where the environmental commissions, if they could start meeting with the commissions in nearby suburbs, I think that could be very helpful. You mentioned that Go Green Wilmette goes beyond our borders. There is a group called Go Green Illinois, and that's not for environmental commissioners. It's for community-based volunteers doing environmental work. And we collaborate constantly. And everything we do is better and more effective because we are learning and working with groups like ours in other communities. So I would really love to see Wilmette share the good things that they're doing and benefit by learning from what other communities are doing as well.
Great. So we got a great question that I think somebody might have an answer to. If people want to get involved, want to be part of this effort, any suggestions for any organizations or village-based activities that you might suggest people would offer to participate in?
We'll let Julie start with that one.
Julie?
Okay. Well, I was going to say Go Green Wilmette is a good place to start.
Oh, I'll definitely follow up.
But I'd say anybody within the village, if you're not already signed up for community solar, you can do that. And there's information on the website because that is available. And it's been vetted by the village. I know some people get mailings and you don't know who it is. This is a program that is safe and reasonable. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that comes to my mind is it's kind of an old school thing, but it's actually new too. Fall and winter are coming. You can look at your house and see how you can improve your energy efficiency. Can you add some insulation? If you're due for a furnace, can you get a more efficient one? Maybe even an electric one. Can you think about how you can encourage your kids to not need cards as much? Can they walk or bike to school? Can you walk or bike more? So just looking at your day-to-day life, I think there's a lot that people can do.
And Julie, I know that the Environmental Commission is always looking for great candidates to step on to serve on your committee. How would they do that if they were interested in that?
Again, the village website, there's something called a talent bank questionnaire. And there are other commissions too, like the Transportation Commission and various other commissions that are doing valuable work. And depending on what the person's background is, there are a number of commissions, but certainly the EEC, the Transportation Commission, even the Plan Commission, is a lot of those. Appearance Review are doing a lot of work towards sustainability. So certainly people can volunteer their time and talent in that way.
Okay, and I would suggest if people are interested in keeping abreast of environmental issues in Wilmette, that they go to the Go Green Wilmette website and sign up for our newsletter, because it comes out about twice a month with some additional reminders for events like this. And there's always something going on that you can get involved with, whether it's a beach cleanup or habitat work or bringing your EV car to show other people. There are lots of ways that you can get involved. So contact Go Green Wilmette if you're looking to do some of the nonprofit work that we do.
Brett and Cindy, I know that in my little planning world, there are just tons and tons of newsletters and e-newsletters and things like that that keep me abreast of all the exciting planning stuff that's going on. If somebody wanted to stay in touch, maybe at a national perspective or broader than just the village level, any suggestions about either websites for people to visit or newsletters for people to plug themselves into?
You know, the couple that I just tend to, it's probably more on the transportation side, but you know, the Shared Use Mobility Center, Smart Cities. I'm always finding information that relates to not just in transportation, but how it relates to other parts of life, of connecting the development. You talk about permeable paver, parking lots, you know, just connecting land development with transportation, with sustainability. So those are a couple that I tend to look at, besides APA stuff.
Of course.
I think the Active Transportation Alliance is also really good if that's something you're interested in. They do really great work.
Okay. A couple of the questions that we got here. If there are any current efforts going on in the village, or there's any suggestions that you're seeing beyond the village about encouraging new construction and renovation Julie mentioned geothermal, for instance, at the library. But any thoughts on what kind of programs or efforts there are for new construction or renovation of houses to be more sustainable in the work that's done there?
Yeah, I know the village is looking at some of that. For some of the recent multifamily buildings, there have been some changes recently. The first several inches of stormwater are required to be kept on site for any building with 10 units or more. And for a couple of the new developments that are going up now, which will be actually rental units, they are pretty close to LEED Silver, I believe. So there definitely is encouragement to follow green building standards with
Great.
those.
There's another question here in the chat asking Julie and Beth if you could comment on dark skies. And maybe somebody could explain it before they comment on it.
Absolutely. That's something we've been looking at the Environmental and Energy Commission. And actually, Go Green had a webinar last year on dark skies, which I was part of, which was really interesting. They had an expert. There's an International Dark Sky Association with a very informative website. But basically, when you wake up in the morning, the sky is blue. That blue is your biological clue to be awake. If you have blue light at night, you're going to stay awake. It disrupts people's biological rhythms and the rhythms of animals, insects, birds, everything else. So basically, dark sky is having lower light levels and more toward the golden tones, because that's what signals nighttime. When we were preparing for the webinar last year, I was curious about what the light levels, because you want to be about 3,000 on what's called a Kelvin scale. And I thought, wonder what that looks like. I wonder if there's an app for that. Found an app that I downloaded on my iPhone, and I went around and I measured the light levels. And it turns out that Wilmette's historic green streetlights are right at the level you want to be for dark sky compliance. And you can see, because biologically your eyes have evolved to see at that sort of light level. So we're studying that in the EEC, and the village is actually doing some recent reviews of some buildings. The commissions that reviewed them suggested dark sky compliant lighting levels for some new buildings. And we're looking at possibly retrofitting some lights in other places. For homeowners, it's as simple as go to the hardware store and get something that is around 1,000 Kelvin and do what we did a few years ago, just switch out the lights on your porch.
Okay.
It can be as simple as that.
So we're coming up on the end of our time. So I wanted to ask our panel. First of all, I wanted to thank you all again very much for sharing your wisdom and your insights and your time, and ask if you had any parting thoughts or anything you wanted to share that you didn't get to mention as part of the discussion so far that you wanted to leave people with.
Julie, you want to start?
Oh, sure. I'm just really pleased that sustainability is a big part of this plan, because I think it's, as Beth said, is absolutely necessary for the future. And I'm very pleased to see integrating the active transportation aspect of it. So I'm looking forward to hearing input from people and seeing what comes out in this whole plan as a result of this.
And as Wilmette competes for new residents to move to our community, many people, especially younger people, are really expecting to live in a sustainable, walkable community. So we have a real incentive to meet that growing demand for that kind of community. And the village has done a terrific job. And I look forward to watching them move ahead with this plan and also implement the bike walk plan.
Excellent. Cindy, Brett, any final thoughts? No.
Exciting. You've got a lot of good plans. You've got the momentum started. I think it's now starting to put the rubber to the road and kind of put these things in place. So sounds like a lot of nice initiatives.
So they taught us at moderator school to take notes and be able to sum up. So here I go. It was interesting. One of the things that I really, and first of all, just thank you all again very much, and to our first panel too. Thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. But a few notes that I took, things that jumped out at me. One, I think everybody should be really pleased with is there's a lot going on right now in terms of what the village is doing and what's going on in and around the village with sustainability and making transportation, non-motorized transportation, really more feasible. And I think that's very exciting. Two is that it's not just about the big things, right? This is not about, building huge things or taking huge steps. Obviously, that's part of it, but there's a lot of little things that can get done. And some of those slides that Cindy and Brett shared about best practices, a lot of those are little things that can be done. And I love the idea that you don't have to try and hit the grand slam home run, but to just, all right, I'll carry the metaphor out, a bunch of singles, score runs too. And I think the idea of being able to do a lot of little things helps keeping this from being scary or overwhelming. I loved hearing about the coordination that's going on across the village and with the organizations in the village and with other towns. I think that's great. And the other part too was the last comment I would make that I heard you all say is that, the improvements, the physical improvements that get made, whether they're for infrastructure or biking or whatnot, they can really be amenities too. They can really add to your sense of place and make an area more attractive and be part of a place where you sit and have a cup of coffee or make you feel safe when you're riding your bike. A lot of comments in the chat had to do with safety and feeling safe, and that's really not that impossible. And those are all those little things. So my parting thoughts anyway. So again, one more thank you to everybody who spoke, everybody who shared ideas, everybody who helped us prepare. Our thanks to the village staff, to Lucas and to John and to Sam, who helped put all this together and curate what we're up to, and to Francie for putting all this together and running the technology here. And thank you to everybody who shared a little bit of your evening with us. And again, the comprehensive plan is something that is being worked on over the next collection of months. I think we gave you a long list of websites to keep up with what's going on in the plan, to keep up with what's going on in the village, to join other organizations. So anybody who is listening either live or on the recording that's inspired to do something, there's plenty of opportunities to do that. So one more time, thank you so much to our panel and those that helped make this event possible, to Francie and the village staff and to my co-consultants on this project. This has really been a lot of fun. So thank you all very much. Have a lovely evening. And we'll look forward to talking with you all again soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.